G'day, legends. I hope that you're having a fantastic Monday and a fantastic, of course, start to the week. Now, for those asking or those wondering, my soup last night was bloody excellent. Now, of course, today, as always, we have a lot to cover. We need to talk about the Peace Summit because we know China is not attending, Russia's not attending, and today now Saudi Arabia has also then said that they will not be attending. So we'll talk at length about that and what will come of this as so the main player here being China has said that it doesn't meet their requirements for a peace summit with both parties not present and I guess taking into account what is actually happening on the ground, as of course they want to have a ending of that in then peace. So we'll talk how China see it, what they've said, what Zelensky has said, what other countries have said, and of course Saudi Arabia. Of course we'll look at the maps and we're also going to be looking at the defensive works and we'll do an extension of what I spoke about yesterday. But why some areas and some rear areas may be in a little bit more danger if some axes are pushed on. And of course, we need to look at the strikes going back into Russia by US weapons, Western weapons, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So of course, the biggest news so far this month, in the last, say, week, is that a lot of restrictions have been lifted on Ukraine for the ability to use US systems, not long-range systems, inside of Russia. So primarily not the ATACMS. That's the big one that Ukraine would want to use to hit other airfields. And we'll look at what Zelensky has said then about this. One question I have, and I should have asked this earlier, does this mean US systems as far as ground vehicles too? Like what would happen here if an Abrams or a Bradley crossed here? So yeah, we know the restrictions were lifted for firing of, HIMARS into here, but what about those systems? We don't really know yet. We have seen, of course, some Humvees and stuff used in here, but regardless, we'll talk more about that. Now, the next video I'm going to put up while I'm just thinking of it is all going to be about spies and intelligence and counterintelligence. So watch that. It'll just be its own thing alone. But let's talk about that. We saw those restrictions lifted. We know France and the UK really led the charge on this as far as major players in this. But I actually got word from a really good friend of mine, a good contact, solid guy, what he believes really the truth of and the political wrangling of these US and Western weapons restrictions being lifted. That he was like, well, yeah, of course, the obvious reason, which is being publicly stated, is to strike buildups of Russian troops in here that Ukraine currently can't hit with Western weapon systems, only domestically produced products. That's the first most obvious and what's being publicized. But in reality, a hell of a lot of this was actually a stunt to try and convince Germany to supply the Taurus system to Ukraine in a show of look at what we're willing to do and to sort of lean on and arm wrestle that down and, hey, then supply the Taurus. Now, we know that Ukraine has been asking for this system for an amount of time. Similarly, in line with, say, the Storm Shadow and Scalp is what that system does. And we know from leaked German phone calls about the system and how it may strike then the Kerch Strait Bridge and how that would actually then be used. We know also there is problems with the production and supply of Scalp and Storm Shadow made in very small numbers because, of course, a lot of them have been used also, and there needs to be some kept in reserve. The Taurus may backfill some of that. Now, Germany has had no real wiggle room on that so far, but saying that this was sort of a political wrangle of look at what we're doing and jump along in line with us. Similarly to the US, we're not supplying tanks, blah, blah, blah. Germany, we're supplying tanks, then the UK goes, okay, we'll supply them, and then the US too. So I thought that was interesting, and let me know what you think of that. And I can see the workaround of this. So we have seen some strikes in here and a lot of evidence of that the ATACMS have been used. Now, I will say I've underlined in here the image claim. This image claimed to show expended rocket pods from US-provided M142 HIMARS in the Kharkiv region. Now, of course, we can't confirm 100% that these were used there, but this photo's been going around everywhere, pro-Ukraine, pro-Russian, Telegram, Twitter, everything. Following recent Ukrainian strikes into the Belgorod region of Western Russia, 54 pods can be seen, meaning that at least 324 rockets were launched by the system, which is a hell of a lot into this area. And we do know that there are confirmed hits as well as multiple firing into here. Now, this is where we also have news today from like unnamed officials that Scalp French Storm Shadow weapons will be allowed to be used inside Russia as well. Now, what we don't know is where the restriction on those weapon systems is from the UK and from the French. What I will say is the day that US signed off that Ukraine could use HIMARS inside Russia, we saw them landing. Now, we have seen restrictions from French and the UK lifted a while back, and we still haven't seen any Storm Shadow or Scalp being used. What tells me then there's still restrictions on those systems. I believe once it's signed off, we'll see within the day those being then used. Now, we have seen at this geolocation here, so of course this is Kharkiv, this is Vovchansk where we talk about, and this is Belgorod. We'll zoom in just on here, that there has been a HIMARS strike here. And of course, with any strikes in this war, very, very difficult to know exactly what was hit. So Ukrainian pages are claiming this was a Russian base with systems and vehicles at it as well. Russian Telegram is saying this was just a market. Now, again, with any strikes in this, it is so difficult to tell. But what I will say on this is, if within the first few days of US weapon systems being signed off to strike within Russia, then there was civilian areas or whatever hit, that would be a massive, massive fallout between Ukraine and the US as well. So I think we know what we know. The US has a hell of a lot of say in when HIMARS are used, how they're used, and what's being targeted with ISR assets on all of this control. And we know there's a direct link between that there's a lot of support given there as well. But also, that means there's going to be a lot of US intel on this too. And the last thing the US would want, and the leaders, both military and political, would be within the first week, you have this informational massive fallout of something being hit that should not have been hit. So I think there would be 100% for these weapon systems being used inside Russia, very, very high scrutiny before any of that is launched, way more than maybe then in occupied territories too. I think it would need a lot more tick boxes because of the nature of where it is then going. So I think likely a military target. That's the long way around of saying this. Now, Zelensky still isn't happy with these restrictions. The Ukrainian president thanked Mr. Biden for giving Kyiv permission to strike inside Russian territory with American munitions, but said restrictions, including the use of long-range ATACMS, should be dropped. In a rare rebuke of his US ally, he said, "Is that sufficient?" No. Why? Because I've given you the example of airfields from which Russia is permanently firing, in calm, knowing that Ukraine will not fire back because it has no corresponding systems and no permissions. Brief outline of an ATACMS and the high cost of these weapon systems. But what we do know is in here, say a Su-34 drops then a glide bomb in here, that, yeah, the best way to hit a plane like that is on the airfield sitting on the ground with something, say, like an ATACMS. Now, some of these airfields are still further out of that range again. But what Zelensky's getting at is we can hit some targets in here, but the planes will still fly well beyond the range of where we can. We need the longer range strikes in there. And I think with everything in this war, with weapons, with restrictions, with whatever, we tiptoe across. So we'll sign off these systems. Okay, then we'll sign off the next systems and the next and the next. And the examples of these are absolutely everything. And I think we're about to see an example of this with the deployment of Western troops. I think that the French will deploy some troops and other countries will deploy some in logistics, third line stuff, and then we go through. I think as well, honestly, I've been thinking a bit about the leaked German phone call with confirming there are, UK officers, troops inside of Ukraine helping with some of the targeting there. And I've thought, is this somewhat maybe even like a purpose leak to right, we'll just leak this, we'll see the fallout of that. Right, okay, there hasn't been that much. Nothing was bloody flattened. Right, let's drip feed in and see where we can push that line very, very gradually. That you take little steps at a time. You don't notice that you've actually started here, you've ended here, but the 2 years in between it of lifting, no massive changes at once, if that makes sense. Now, let's look at the map. So let's just zoom out here quickly. So this is Ukraine, the center, the capital of Kyiv. Red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now, the green is areas of which Russia has been and has either withdrawn or been pushed out of. Now, anything blue is Ukrainian territory made within 2 weeks. Anything green checked, we're not really sure. Anything red checked is Russian advancement in the last 24 hours. Now, the green checked on this, I believe some of it should be blue. We'll talk about that in 1 second. So let's come down here, Zap Oblast. Now, we did see a change yesterday on this map, and I just want to extend on what I spoke about yesterday. I may not have been very clear with it. So we see this red push in here. Don't worry about the change we saw there. We'll talk about it in 1 second. And why this push and why the angle of this may actually be of then concern. So I showed you yesterday this from a Ukrainian page. This advance could potentially reach our rear, which protects Robotny and Kyiv, a key point, Ukrainian defense of Zap region. Why is this angle then important? Well, we saw during the Ukrainian counter-offensive, Offensive 23, we saw then a push down in here. Now, if we look at Clement Molin's maps that gives then the Ukrainian defensive works, we can see that there is a gap, of course, between Kyiv and Robotny down here. Now, I'll put my cursor, but right about here is where we saw that first advancement yesterday, and right about here. Now, depending on the angle of advance of these, it could really have a problem if it comes, say, west to east, or something from Murny east to west on these rear areas that, of course, are supplying into Robotny. So pushing across then where my cursor is here. And, of course, those defensive works are made to stop an advancement coming then this way, coming north. See how they're put out? It would be the other way. Unlike these, you can see where they're built for different angles of advancement. But that could threaten that, in line with what then that Ukrainian Twitter blogger said. So that is interesting then to look at. Now, we'll come up to today. We'll turn this on, and we see out from Bakhati here and Murny, we see this green checked. Now, to me, this means Ukraine has made ground within the last 24 hours, but I believe within 2 weeks, it should actually be blue by the key on this map. But regardless, let's then talk about this, as Syriac actually gives us a better update on here of this advancement. So this red dot is Murny, and this is Bakhati down here just to line up. And now these maps now show very, very similar. Situations up front. Modifications were made, Murny, Lvivsky axis. Much of this territory, thought to be under Russian control, eventually fell under Ukrainian control. In addition, Ukrainian forces made small advances north of Bakhati. So that it was a map correction for some of it, which would line more up with this being green, but that Ukraine made some small advancements. So I believe some of this should be green and some should be blue to show a Ukrainian advancement in here as well, in line with what Syriac is saying. Regardless, now we know that the map in this direction is very, very similar. We're still waiting on Robotny front in here and what will come up. Now, we're going to look at more of those defensive works in a second once we just look at other maps. Now, we don't have anything down the south here until we really come up into the east, and we have then the Avdiivka front. And all we see is out from Ulmansk here, just a small Russian advancement into then these tree lines in here. And this is the axis we know Russia's pushing on a lot. That said, I think with this, within the south, within the north, within Bakhmut, everywhere, Russia's pushing, I think, on multiple axes to find where may be a weak spot before they launch into a full, like a full offensive. That said, I still don't know if we will see a Russian full offensive. I don't see the absolute necessity to do that in an attritional wearing down phase of the war, and of course the risk versus reward of that. But I can see the risk of the informational space of they're launching this, but because America has given Ukraine now ease restriction of strikes into Russia, we've spoilt the complete Russian offensive plans to the north, and they never launched it. I could see the capitalization on the informational space there. I don't know if we will see just this pouring in of 150,000 guys into an area. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. But it will be interesting then to see. I'm not seeing really much of the build-up myself from what I see. But we see then that change in here. Now, let's go just up into Bakhmut, unless I had something else to show you in here. No. And then we will look here. No changes shown on this map. But we do then see we have a change on Syriac. Now, mainly up here in Kalinivka, Bodanivka. We saw yesterday those Russian troops get dropped off on the other side of the waterway here, and likely didn't have a very successful fate there from hit by the drones, and then how much mutual support would you have there. But the situation east Chasiv Yar, situation around Kalinin became clear. Russian troops managed to settle in some trenches along the canal. The locality is mostly under control of the Russian army, except for the northern part of the hill and the warehouse. So we do know that they are pushing on multiple axes in here for Chasiv Yar. Now, really three. They're pushing down into Kalinivka, depending on where you think the border is, but we do know there is a push here. And of course, Russia is pushing through the forest belts here. Now, we will see potentially the plan of envelopment, which we typically see, but I believe this will need to be cut off first due to the fire support that will come from Ukraine out of here before we see a close-up of this and a push through on Chasiv Yar, if that is possible, regardless, because we know this area is moving very slow and it's been heavily defended. We'll look at defensive works in areas such as this in just a little bit. But as far as changes then on this deep state map, that is all we've got today. But we'll come up into Vovchansk and we'll talk about this, where the Russian push here has really stalled out as well. But what we don't know is what the overall outcome of this was ever to be. But we do see NOEL reports then shows here, this is the claimed Ukrainian armed forces then recaptured area in the center of Vovchansk. Now, this isn't showing it on the deep state map, but he's showing it then there. We have a geolocation of where an American striker has been taken out. So this is then Vovchansk here. We'll come down. This is the Vovcha River. So out here, there has been some bridges made of the Vovcha River. We have seen Russia strike a lot of these bridges in those initial days. And then we see, so that's sitting out here, we then see a US supplied striker to Ukraine, then destroyed on one of the makeshift bridges across here as well. You can see this other bridge here has then been struck and taken down as well. Crossing waterways is incredibly difficult for infantry, even more difficult for armor. And this is why I think the realistic threat down in Kherson, now these bridges are basically non-existent, of Russia crossing one way, Ukraine crossing the other without massive losses is going to be almost impossible due to the drones, due to all of this. You may see little recon elements crossing, but the amount of equipment you need to get across quickly via some means is going to be incredibly difficult in here with drones and artillery and constant bloody surveillance everywhere here. Now, speaking of all this, let's then have a look at some defensive works. Now, I want to talk down in here this front. Now, Zelensky spoke about yesterday that he didn't want a pause in the war, some ceasefire, due to if Russia gets into a position of which they have a lot of control over, Ukraine being demilitarized and or land concessions. He doesn't want to give them that opportunity. Now, I believe a big one of that opportunity would come if Odessa fell under occupation or was surrounded, because instantly Ukraine's massive financial, economic sort of golden goose of shipping gets then cut off. And we believe this is what Russia was trying to do from this front line out from Mykolaiv to join into, this is Transnistria here, to get to the other troops that are in here, as well as all the Soviet weapon systems in here, to essentially cut off then Odessa. And Ukraine definitely do see this as a threat in Transnistria as well. We then see down here from Clement Mollin, we do see massive buildup of new defensive works down, these is the blue, down along then the border, these blue lines here sitting out from the border of defensive works sitting out from Transnistria. So we can know that, that has been put as there's enough of a threat there to warrant the buildup of defensive works. But like I spoke, crossing waterway like that, going to be bloody hard. But there are a lot of defensive works, and this will line up as well with down in this ZAP front that we showed you in the beginning and the threats there. But this will just give you a better idea of the extent of some of these works down in here. So we're looking at the same area. This is the area we spoke about between Robotny and Orokhiv, and the multi-layered defensive works by Ukraine, and how some of they see how, like up near ZAP, that these are facing for then a westwards attack. So if there was breakthroughs in areas, that is where they've put these defensive works for something like this, rather than by the layout, rather than of a straight northern push into somewhere like ZAP itself. And of course, there's been a lot of build-up around Huliopol, as we have seen Russia push a little bit on that front recently then as well. Now let's have a look in Avdiivka, where we were speaking about just before. In here, there is some movement. And of course, between Avdiivka, Pokrovsk, and then Konstantinivka is the very important area then around here. And we can see just out from then Avdiivka, this is the green of where Russia was at some point. Now we actually believe it's a lot further up. Of course, down in here is Ulmansk, but you can see that all this blue, these are the defensive works, have fallen under then Russian control. And you can see, of course, the defensive works building out into the areas of, say, like Pokrovsk. So still the defensive works Russia would have to go through. So let's have a look here before getting somewhere, shrink this, before getting somewhere like Pokrovsk, of these build-up of defensive lines, but those of which that have come under control so far. So that is interesting to look at as well. Now, let's have a look up in the north area. I should have done this. I was looking at the maps, but regardless, I sort of wanted to keep it a bit separate. So we hear a lot. There may be a front line open in Sumy instead of what we've seen in Kharkiv here to try and further stretch the Ukrainian forces. And let's have a look then at the defensive works here. Now, many are pointing at what happened in the north and the non-existent build-up of defensive works around in here. This is the Lipsy front line, how a lot of these just got walked over, And then we see between, then this is Kharkiv, and then this is Sumy, that these lines in here aren't very thick. Maybe this is why Russia is trying to push across. And you can see how far back these lines are then from the border if Russia did want to make some sort of buffer demilitarized zone in here, as Putin has spoken about. These are very, very interesting maps. And we can see as well, when I speak about the threat of you're not going to put assets somewhere of which you don't believe has a real threat. We can see Ukraine is building defensive works as well between, say, Kiev and then Belarus as well. So we'll just show you, this map might be a bit easier, Kiev, Belarus, and that there are, as Clement said, huge defensive works then being built here. So this is Kyiv, just at the bottom where this 90 basically sits, and these defensive works then along the border. Now, these aren't the easiest to see, but we'll zoom in and get you a little bit of a better idea. Now, this is Pripyat, Chernobyl areas, I'm sure, of which you are familiar with. You can see these defensive lines. Now, he has satellite imagery of these as well. Now, what we need to understand is it looks little on a map. This is massive. So this comes from almost Vilkovka here, almost all the way to Pripyat. So let's actually give a measurement of distance as the crow flies. So straight, we're talking 26, well, this is exact marathon distance. So, of course, a lot longer when it goes up and down and through different areas. So these are massive defensive works being built up here, then back from the border. Now, we do know the Center of Disinformation of Ukraine said that no, there's no threat coming from Belarus. This is just disinformation propaganda coming through. But we've seen it before. You can never discount that. And obviously, building defensive works there means that there's not a complete discount of that either. Now, like I said right in the beginning, is Saudi Arabia has now said that they won't be, or I should say it actually hasn't been completely official confirmed there, but through other people and everyone's reporting on this, that they won't be present at the Global Peace Summit to support Ukraine because Russia will not be there. Diplomatic sources told the agency that Volodymyr Zelensky's plan to visit Saudi Arabia on June the 1st to rally support has been postponed until after the summit. The Peace Summit will be held in the 15th and 16th Bergenstock Resort, 5-star resort in Switzerland. So they're not going to be there and actually pushing the meeting with Zelensky till then after this. So I would say Saudi Arabian, they want to know what happens at this to then start what they're going to speak about with Zelensky. Now, as we know, Saudi Arabia has been, of course, kept relations open with both Russia and with Ukraine, and of course has been a massive mediator in many aspects of the war so far, most publicly, I guess, in the exchange of prisoners of war. And these countries are very, very important. Countries like this, countries like China, to keep in for things like this. Now, Zelensky has then also accused China of discouraging other countries from attending the peace summit in Switzerland, saying the world has to be resilient, it needs to be strong, and it has to pressure Russia. There is no other way to stop Putin. Only diplomatic isolation, a strong Ukrainian military, and for all the countries of the world, not balanced between Ukraine and Russia, but to defend international law, justice and law. And he was disappointed some world leaders will not attend. Told media China had supported such efforts to deter leaders from participating. Regrettably, Russia, using Chinese influence on the region, using Chinese diplomats also, does everything to disrupt the peace summit. It is unfortunate that such a big, independent, powerful as China is an instrument in the hands of Putin. And I think Zelensky needs to be careful with these wording about China and the influence of what he obviously knows, a lot of influence to Russia from China, but could you push them that way further and China start supplying, a lot more weapons and all this other systems, that won't have a good outcome on the war as a whole. I think Don't want to push Russia and China then further together than this then already has. Now, I will say with Saudi Arabia as well, that we of course know Saudi Arabia has a lot of very strong thoughts about what is happening in Israel and Palestine. And I know that that will have an effect on then things like what we see other countries rallying behind these peace conferences over here. And of course, where countries are lying, how they see to this, especially with Russia. We know how they see that, and Saudi, and there will be, of course, a mutual standing of this as well to use to the advantages too. Now, furthermore, earlier on Sunday, the Chinese Defense Minister Dong Lu-jun told attendees of Shangri-La Dialogue his country had been promoting peace talks with a responsible attitude. We have never provided weapons to either party of this conflict, which we have seen. And the UK has said that been supplying a lot of equipment into Russia as well. We have put stricter control on the export of dual-use items and never done anything to fan the flames. We stand firmly on the side of peace and dialogue. And this negotiation, like I've spoken about, this peace summit thing, it's not a negotiation. It's not to have an end of the war come out of it. And it's not to open dialogue with Russia at the end of this peace summit. It's to get more weapons into Ukraine to support their 10-point peace plan, to have a military victory over Russia here. And the only way to have that victory will be to push through Donetsk, Crimea, and all the occupied then territories. Well, it will take a lot of commitment, support, troops, weapons, if possible, then at all. Zelensky has had this to say then on Twitter. I addressed the dialogue and stressed that the last few decades have seen diplomacy fail to achieve its task. Ukraine has found a way to restore the force of diplomacy. We've proposed peace through diplomacy, an inclusive and fair format, the Global Peace Summit. Inclusive, fair format would mean that all parties, if Russia was invited, China would be there too, Saudi would be there too. So and through diplomacy, well, this war will end through diplomacy regardless of where the front line ends. All war eventually ends in diplomacy. So we will see. I think the peace summit with these I don't care. I know there's a celebration if some leader from some small country somewhere says we're going. If Biden's not going to be there, he's going to be in some Hollywood thing with the other weirdos on the bloody island that go to those. And then China's not coming, Russia's not coming, Saudi's not coming. I don't know. I just think it's a holiday in a Birkenstock for, I don't know, trying to get more billions of dollars, which I get, but don't call it a peace summit and say it's an inclusive and fair summit. It's not looking to end with peace, that it's looking for more support to support the peace plan of pushing back through these territories militarily. It's a rallying support summit. Yeah. Now, this video of an Abrams, this is very interesting. I'll post this fully on the Telegram if you'd like to see, but it does talk over some of the issues with the Abrams that haven't had a huge then effect. So we knew people were talking this, we can't wait to see this rolling across, and of course it hasn't had that effect. And this is actually done, I believe, by CNN, but the armor is not sufficient. Therefore, on the battlefield, the crew doesn't survive. And we know we have seen these putting on extra armor as well as cope cages and things like this on top of these systems as well. We have ammunition direct tank-to-tank battle, like Sabo, say, but more often we work as artillery, exactly like we have seen firing into Avdiivka. The video I showed you the other day, part of a tree line or a building, and working more as artillery of these systems. And this is what we spoke about, fired 17 rounds into a house, that some of these systems, you're better off having cheaper systems in much higher much higher quantities rather than one expensive system that you've got in much lower quantities as well. And this is the same as, say, artillery as well. I think the West is so focused on the best single product, but if that single product can't get into the fight, you've got one expensive product that's just sitting there. The best example of these were the Excalibur rounds for artillery. Excalibur rounds, of course, yeah, it's GPS guided, it's great, yahoo. But once they were jammed and the efficiency of those dropped by somewhere in the realm of 90%, you've got a few number of very expensive dumb shells again. So you have then problems there. That talking about, we have aviation or artillery, that we only have the tank, so working on its own with that combined arms. It of course provides a lot of question, and many people saying, well, then use proper armored doctrine. Armored doctrine of this century relies on artillery and other combined arms systems and aircraft then as well. Why does it take so long, and why does it come then partially? So, of course, this dripping in, like we have said, of these systems. And in this as well, they do talk about the reliability of this system too. So, interesting to talk about. But legends, look after yourselves, have a great day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.